Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special edition of Oxnard Live. I'm Dan Chavez Jr. Tonight, we'll be speaking with Oxnard City Manager Alex Nguyen, and just a little bit about him that we already know, but just want to reaffirm. He's been with our city for a little over 2 years, and he has come with over 20 years experience in municipal government, coming from the cities of Oakland, Alameda, and most recently Riverside, and has been hitting the ground running to make Oxnard better. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Oxnard City Manager Alex Nguyen. Alex.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for providing me with this time. I'm happy to be one of your interviewees.
Thank you. And I appreciate you accepting the offer. And as we spoke, we have a lot to cover. We have 5 measures to cover. But before we get to the measures, I kind of want to know a little bit about your experience with the city so far and how it's compared to the other cities that you worked at.
Okay. Well, I certainly Oxnard has been exciting most of the time, challenging very often, sometimes quite interesting. But overall, I have no regrets about coming here and taking this job on. And it's very rewarding in terms of the profession of city management. So I've had a great time.
Great. I appreciate that. So let's just dive right into it because 5 measures, we have a good amount of chunk of time set aside for us to get through these in details. And I know there has been residents that submitted questions to me, and many of the questions may be repeats to what you've already discussed previously, but we'll still go ahead and ask them. So the first measure, Measure E, which is put on by the city, that is a 1.5% 1.5% local sales tax for city services. Tell me about Measure E in a few bullet points.
Okay. Do you mind if I can provide a context, because it didn't just pop out of my head from out of nowhere.
Yes,
So
of course.
if I can give it a context, and maybe going back to your opening question about my experience here. So obviously, when I applied for this job, I did as much research as I could, read as much of the history as I could find. And so I knew what I was walking into in terms of the challenges at City Hall in Oxnard. So in the 2 years that I've been here, we've actually managed to build a new executive team. When I arrived here, I actually had 6 vacancies among the executive ranks. We've also implemented systems changes to prevent repeats of the problems of the recent past and to also just increase our overall workflow. So a few things I want to highlight, and this, I hope this helps to set Measure E in context. So we implemented the Sunshine Ordinance, and in a nutshell, what that does is it provides all of the materials that are going to the City Council for City Council action 12 whole days prior to that council meeting. Without the Sunshine Ordinance, we were only providing that documentation 3 days in advance. So basically on a Friday for a Tuesday evening. So now we have that. There's just no way that people are going to be surprised about big decisions coming to the City Council. Everyone now has 12 whole days. So I'm very proud that this City Council implemented that unanimously. We also instituted the council committee system. And this is really important because now with this system, subcommittees of the City Council can really tackle any item or issue that is significant. They can really sink their teeth and their brains into it. And it also gives more time, not only for the council members, but for the public to weigh in on significant issues. And we also were successful in implementing term limits and campaign finance limits, which was approved by the voters, I believe by 82% of the vote. And that's also really important in terms of limiting how much external funding can influence our city hall. We've also tackled some of the budget's major challenges. Remember, in my first year here, I was confronting a $9.2 million deficit in the city's budget. So we took care of many problems. We ended the long-term subsidies at the golf course and at the Performing Arts Center. We unfortunately needed to close the museum to save money so we could live within our means. We implemented a host of stronger financial controls. We had actually a financial audit. We had the best one this past year that we've had since 2015. Hopefully I'll get to talk about that more later. We also conducted an audit with a third-party firm of the public safety overtime usage, and that came back clean. They did not find any problems. We updated the city's development impact fees, which hadn't been done for nearly 3 decades. And actually, in some cases, there were fees that were still being charged for developers building here in Oxnard that go back to 1972. So we finally updated those. I personally attended in my first year over 30 community meetings. And then this past year, I was able to get to 25, believe it or not, before COVID hit. We successfully streamlined our permitting process. That helped us get the Sakioka Farms property across the finish line with their map and their development agreement. We actually changed our approach to tackling the homeless problem. Right? We made a 180-degree shift from just spending money to moving the homeless problem from neighborhood to neighborhood, and we're now actually investing in solving homelessness for individuals. And we have 2 homeless housing facilities that we're on the verge of getting. And if we can get those, they will help us get up to 300 homeless individuals off of the streets. And I guarantee you, when we can reach those kinds of numbers, we will make a significant improvement in what's been happening here with the homeless crisis. We also negotiated a $25 million trust fund to dismantle the Ormond Beach power plant. And we have ideas, we've developed ideas to invest and revitalize South Oxnard, right? We have, and unfortunately, the pandemic and the recession has put everything on hold, but these ideas are still live and on the table. So we have to create a business improvement district along the Saviors Corridor, to build a Zocalo, a public civic gathering space for South Oxnard, create an Oxnard employee pipeline, a partnership with Oxnard College, the city, and the Chamber of Commerce, and also to create the Oxnard Arts Academy, right, which is the best way for the city to help our youth succeed in schools. And it's something that we can do as an after-school program. So why do we need Measure E, and why did I ask the City Council to place it on the ballot? It is because it is revenue that we need in order to restore services and programs that our community needs and also, frankly, quite deserves. So it is not about money that we want to do some Taj Mahal project. It is about money we need, because it's simply, the revenues we have are simply not enough to provide and maintain services for a city of this size. So a couple of examples would be, Measure E would restore services such as neighborhood community policing, the paramedic squads for the fire department, a host of youth and senior services that have been cut over the years, maintenance of our trees and our parks and our medians, and as well as our roads. It could, for the first time, give us the ability to program a rebuilding and maintenance program for the alleys. Recall that we have 70 miles worth of alleys in the city, but there's never been money set aside for it. The gas tax that we get from the state can only be used to maintain and fix the roads, not the alleys. So those are examples of why we need Measure E. Now, it will not be a blank check, as I've heard people raise concern about. It cannot be a blank check. There are very strong, rigid guardrails in terms of municipal funding and expenditures. So I can't just take this money and go spend it willy-nilly on anything that I want. And I understand that people are making those allegations or have those concerns, but it will not be a blank check. There will be accountability. And finally, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And one of the ones that is disturbing is to claim that this is all about pensions, and it is not. So Measure E is what we need, not because we just decided we wanted more money to play with. We need Measure E, otherwise we're going to lose more services and programs. And I'll stop with that. That was a long answer. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the response and the context that was brought up. You mentioned accountability with Measure E. Now, one of the big questions that come up when people are talking about Measure E or they hear about Measure E is the lack of oversight. Now, what type of oversight is going to be applied to Measure E? And it is my understanding that it's very different than what Measure O received as an oversight.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So Measure oversight is going to be layered. So first and foremost, I can't just, and by the way, when I say I mean the city's executive team, right? I don't make and implement decisions by myself. I don't sit in my office and lock the door and just make decisions. I have a team of professionals in their fields, and we work through the best ways to serve this city, and then we make recommendations to the council. So that's number one. Number two, whatever it is that we're going to recommend to the council is published 12 days in advance of the council taking action on it. Number three, it's even more notice than that because we have the Finance and Governance Committee. So before it gets published for the 12 days before the council, it gets published 7 days before the committee. So in all, that's 19 days for the public to weigh in. It's 19 days to review the recommendations, 19 days to call your council members, to tell them what you like, what you don't like, what you would like to see changed. So there's plenty of public notice for that. So the recommendations first go through the Finance Committee, and they would have to weigh and balance if they agree with our recommendations, or they can grill us, or they can actually send us back to rework the recommendations. So the first true checks and balance and accountability is from the Finance and Governance Committee. And then 12 days in the public arena with whatever the recommendations are. So let's say we're talking about $1 million and we're proposing, 10 buckets of spending for $100,000 each. That would be available for the public to review and weigh in on. Then it goes to the city council, and then we make the recommendation there. And then the Finance Committee explains to the city council what their rationale was, and then the council has to have a discussion and a debate. And remember, these are all public meetings where the community gets to weigh in, even if they don't weigh in ahead of time during the 19-day period. So there's your checks and balances, and there's your oversight. There is no way for me to willy-nilly spend this money on anything that I want. I can guarantee that. And that's the oversight, because they are the people elected to represent the community. And that's how the system works.
Now, what do you say to those that say, well, the council's just going to do whatever the city manager says and they're not going to stand up to him? So there's really no oversight or, accountability to the residents. What do you say to those people that make those allegations or those statements?
I say, show me what's happened in my 2 years here. Again, that plays to the narrative of cheap rhetoric that I'm a dictator, or that, like just the way you phrase your question, that the council won't stand up to the city manager. Look at the council members. You really think that that's who they are? Now, remember, I brought a budget with $9.2 million of cuts on the table, and they struggled over those, and they did not do what I had recommended. And actually, frankly, they made a few choices that were much better than what I had proposed. And that's how the system works. And they also did it with the public weighing in. I actually remember you were there weighing in and you weren't happy with what I had recommended. I remember that. So there's your evidence. And there's a slew of other issues where they don't agree with what staff recommendation is. They didn't agree with staff recommendation on the short-term rental ordinance. They didn't agree with staff recommendations to go fast with cannabis. And there's a slew of issues, but that's how the system works. This is not a one-man show, but it's also not a one-person show of the electeds either. That's why we have 7 of them. So I think all the evidence, at least in the time that I've been here, would point to the fact that the checks and balances work.
Now, there's also that question that comes up as to why isn't there a sunset date? Measure O does have one, but Measure E is coming and it's asking for a little bit more than what Measure O is asked for. And it's similar in the sense that it is a general tax that it can technically be used for anything. So why not implement a sunset date?
Okay. So the easy way to answer that is to actually point to Measure O. If you look at the expenditures of Measure O, and I want to repeat for everyone, Measure O was never misspent. It had to be spent in different proportions because of the Great Recession, but it was never misspent. That's number one. Number two, Measure O is getting ready to sunset. And when it does, if we don't change our game plan now, which is what we're trying to do with Measure E, our budget will have a huge hole in it. We're talking about an entire fire station, police officers, youth services, senior services, library services. And that's why if I had asked the council to place Measure E on with a sunset, while it might have been easier, it would have been irresponsible of me, because all I would have done is to set up the identical fiscal crisis 10, 15 years down the line for the next group of executives and elected officials at City Hall. This is based on an analysis of what we need for a city of this size with the aging infrastructure that we have to provide the services and programs that we need and deserve. This is not a, hey, let's have a cushion for X number of years. Again, I only point back to Measure O. When it expires, we're going to have a genuine fiscal crisis here. So that's the reason. It is exactly what we need. And it would be irresponsible of me, although it would be easier for me as a city manager to do a sunset, but I know that's the wrong thing because I've seen it happen not only here, but in other cities.
Now, you made mention about Measure O and how it's allocated, and Measure O has saved the general fund multiple times over the past few years, and even most recently when it came to a fire station in South Oxnard, that Measure O was used. But let me ask you, because another question that always seems to come up is the city's pension liability towards CalPERS. We know that over the past few years, and this is even before you became city manager, that the budget was being cut, and the one pesky thing that always kept coming up was the pension liability. How much of Measure E, if any, is ultimately planned or kind of earmarked to go towards that pension liability?
So I heard something. Right. If we were to use all of Measure E, it'd probably be about $5 million out of the 40. Okay, but let me explain the pension liability a little bit, because people seem to be arguing that a past promise and obligation is somehow something that we can play with now, and we simply can't. Not only has the California Supreme Court upheld that, but it's also would be morally and ethically wrong to do so. So we have right now the pension obligation actually goes towards more people who've already retired than people who are actually working. And thanks to pension reform, which was enacted in 2013, going forward, everyone hired from 2013 forward actually has a much less generous pension package and pays more into their retirement funds. So it's actually sustainable. Pension reform will, over time, it will take a few generations, it will fix the problem, even here in Oxnard. And our employees now, even though it was only in 2013, we already have 35% of our workforce are part of the pension reform cohort, the new employees. Now, imagine if you served the city of Oxnard, or frankly, any other city in California for 25, 30 years, whether you were a police officer or a truck driver for the garbage company, and you retired and now you're relying on your pension. Imagine if I just said, you know what, it's too much money, we're just going to stop paying you. That's just wrong. So the challenge which has been met is to fix the pension formula going forward. And again, pension reform was enacted in 2013. It just takes a little time to work its way through the system in terms of generations that retire. And we're making great progress on it anyway.
Now, how much, if Measure E was to pass this November, um, first question is, when does it go into effect? And then the second question is, how much can the city expect to collect on Measure E?
Goes into effect next spring. And right now, the forecast is approximately 40 million. But again, it's really difficult to know right now given the pandemic and the recession. So we still don't really, nobody has the crystal ball with regard to the impending vaccine or when the economy will truly recover. No one has that crystal ball. One thing I do want to make clear, though, and I've stated this to the city council in writing, and I think I've mentioned it to the public. I would strongly recommend to the city council that if Measure E is approved by the voters, the very first quarter where we get the new added sales tax, that we should shove all of it back into the city's reserves in case there's another emergency that hits us. Our reserve right now, as you know, is really, it's just anemic. We are on thin ice. So my recommendation would be to take the very first quarter of the increased sales tax and just shove it into the reserve, not spend a penny of it.
And I'm glad that you brought up the reserves because that's been, I would go ahead and assume, and although assuming is a bad thing, but I would assume that we're not the only city across the nation that is dipping into the reserves and ultimately using all of the reserves during this pandemic phase to try to stay afloat, right?
I would agree with that. Even in California, I bet there are only a handful of cities that had enough healthy reserves to make it through this initial year of the pandemic. I'm pretty certain because by definition, your reserve is your rainy day fund. And man, 2020 has been nothing but one rainy day. So we've had to spend ours, and I'm certain many other cities have as well.
Now, the city, a couple of budgets ago, and this, again, this goes back to before you were here. I want to say maybe a budget or two before you were here. Um, I actually stood in front of the city council and I told them to put more into the reserves because it was so important because they were projecting the slope for the amount of money in our reserves was just going to be less. It was just a ridiculous amount. And we were somewhat healthy. Do you have any plans to maybe bring back to the city council a revised reserve plan? One that maybe raises the percentage of how much we're supposed to keep in our reserves versus let's deplete the whole thing and then we'll try to rebuild it Because I know in the
Mhm.
city of Camarillo, they have like a 50% reserve, and that's just their minimum. So they have a lot in reserves that, but they're also in a different income bracket than the city of Oxnard is.
So if, if Measure E, I would definitely recommend a council. Now, I wouldn't recommend 50% because that's just sitting on way too much cash. Remember, the money we have in the general fund should be spent to provide goods and services for the people who are paying the taxes here, both property and sales tax. So it wouldn't make sense for a city of our size to have a 50% reserve because you're just sitting on cash and not serving the public. But I would definitely bring back a recommendation that is higher than where we are now. Absolutely.
So, what happens to our city if this November the voters said, no, I cannot support Measure E, and Measure E fails? What are the next steps that our city has to take moving forward?
Well, we wouldn't just go bankrupt, right? Because we do get revenue now. What we would have to do is continue cutting back on services and programs, and that would obviously that would diminish the current low levels of services and programs that we have, right? So whether it's the roads, the parks, the medians, the youth programs, the libraries, the senior services, we would just shrink all of that down as much as we can. I am convinced that the priorities, just because these are the priorities in every community, would be public safety. So we would hold off. We might be able to hold off for a year in terms of eating into the public safety budget. But the bottom line is, if you can only spend what you have, and and since you've been following the budgets over the years, the cuts have been happening year after year. So we'd have to make some really, really, really painful cuts, and the overall quality of life will degrade. Not just the physical and aesthetic quality of Oxnard, but the social and civic quality of life in Oxnard will degrade. And here's the thing that is ironic. Um, if you take away all of your civic service programs that make a community healthy and vibrant, you're actually going to end up with more problems in our neighborhoods, and you're going to end up relying more on public safety services. So it would make Oxnard a just a very um, third-rate city. Frankly, it would just be third-rate in so many ways, and there's really no reason for it. There's really no reason for it. The sales tax amount that I'm proposing in Measure E, unlike what has been told, on social media, it does not make our sales tax rate the highest in the state. It actually puts us right at the middle. Okay, currently, there are over 300 cities in California that already have a higher sales tax rate than ours. So if this is approved, we'd still be right around the middle. And the key is this: of the tax increase, unlike all of the other cities, we actually get to keep the entire increase here. This increase is for Oxnard, stays in Oxnard always. It will never go to the county or the state. It's here for the things we need. This is not a sales tax increase that goes to the state and the county. So that's also very, very important.
Now, one of the other questions, and I know you read the newspaper and watch the TV, where there's a lot of calls for defunding the
Mhm,
police.
mhm.
And we know our city pays a good amount into our public safety, and public safety being police and fire and any additional services that those two provide. What do you say to those that say, well, why do we have to put this whole chunk of Measure E towards public safety? Why can't we flip the script and put it towards youth and senior services or our parks, because our parks are just falling apart ultimately?
So the first thing I say is that that's a very, very false choice for this community. So it isn't about public safety or youth services, seniors, or parks. That's a false choice. So number one, look at the fact that in this city and how well our police department has done, our crime rates have been going down year after year for 4 straight years. For a city of our size, for over 200,000 people, this is, even though we don't have a lot of tall buildings, this is an urban community now, surrounded by farmland, but an urban community. So if you compare us to cities of our size here in California, but as well as across the nation, you will be very impressed at how safe we are. And that's something that's very important, because safety is one of the first things people look at when they want to invest in a community or move to a community, in addition to the quality of the education. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is, during this year, after George Floyd and the catalyst that became across the nation, and actually, frankly, still continues, and with the Black Lives Movement becoming very, very almost mainstream in terms of how far spread it is across the country, and how frequent these events occur, and how they've lasted. Right? This is not one of those things where you have a couple of weekends of protests and then it subsides. It continues to happen. Now look at Oxnard. The only protests we've had here have been extremely, extremely civil. Extremely civil. People have not looted our community. People have not trashed our community. People have not burnt our community. And that's a testament to the quality of service of our police department. That's just a fact. Again, look at any big city, and that's a fact. And frankly, you're seeing some very, very negative behavior occur even in some small cities. Another point to take into account with police, if we, and this is a point I keep making, our employees, including our police officers, have a choice of what cities they work in. Therefore, there is a labor market even amongst cities and counties in California. Now, we have a history of occasionally losing some very good police officers and firefighters to other jurisdictions because they pay a lot more. So if we don't pay what is needed to get the best officers and firefighters, we're going to be stuck with second and third rate public safety personnel. Last year, there was an article in the LA Times talking about cities who've had to resort to hiring police officers who actually had been arrested and convicted of certain crimes. I do not want to run a city where we are going to have to resort to hiring second-rate police officers or firefighters. And if we don't do our best to attract and retain the best public safety staff, here's exactly what happens. People will join our academies because we have great training, right? The reputations of both our fire academies and police academies is top notch in the state. They will come here, they will get trained extremely well, they will serve for 1 or 2 years, and then they'll go get a higher paying job. So in essence, what we would be doing is training officers and firefighters in the field for other cities to enjoy the fruits of our labor. That is not a good scenario to be in. So it isn't about choosing between public safety and all the civic programs that I mentioned. We need to do both because there is a cycle there and there's an interconnectedness there. we can't provide the youth programs, I guarantee you, we're going to need many, many more police.
And I'm glad that you brought up the salaries thing, because that also, as long as I've been involved with our city over the past few years, that's always been one of the hot topics, is the salaries that the executive team receives, that certain members of the city receives. And most recently, people are saying that Measure E is ultimately going to go to all of that, that it's going to go to your pockets, it's going to go to the other executive member pockets. What do you say to those people that think that, that's Measure E is only going to go towards salaries?
So, first thing I will say, because I'm just telling it the way it is, most of our budget goes to salaries because that's how we provide programs and services. So it's people, it's human beings. I've joked before that we're not at a place yet where we can do much of the work we do with robots. Perhaps that day will come, maybe, sometime when you're running the city, but it's not here in my time. So it is salaries is where the bulk of city budgets go, all cities. So when people want to look at our salaries, that's fair because it's open and public, but you have to also look at it in context of all the other cities in our county and in California. And this is the point that's significant, that everybody who uses the salaries as a rhetorical device to say this is the city doesn't need more revenue. We do not operate in a vacuum. Oxnard, there's not a bubble around Oxnard, right? So we pay competitive salaries so that we can attract and retain the most talented people in their respective fields. Again, if you don't want to do that, you will get second-rate staff for everything. And given the problems that the city's had in the last 10, 15 years, do you really think second-rate employees are going to get the city back on the right path? So I understand that I make a very high salary, especially compared to many families here, but it is the salary range of city managers in California. So even if you want to get rid of me, when you go to look for the next city manager, you're going to have to pay that man or woman a competitive salary. And it's the same for police and firefighters. We don't exist in a bubble. We compete with other cities and counties for talented staff.
Thank you for that answer, Alex. Is there any final comments before we move on to our next measure that you want to leave the residents with about Measure E?
Well, bottom line is Measure E is revenue that we need to provide the services and programs that we need and deserve to have in this city. It is not some desire to go do something fancy or extravagant or lavish with taxpayer dollars. It's really to restore a host of services and programs that we've lost over the years. We have to do this. Thanks.
Thank you. So the next measure that we're going to tackle is Measure F, which is supposed to be the expediting of permitting within the city. This is a measure that was brought to the Oxnard residents from a resident, Mr. Starr. What is your position on this particular measure?
It makes me actually quite unhappy because it is these measures, not just this one, but and I'm glad that you're going to ask me about all of them, but it's really ill-informed, and frankly, it's really dangerous, and it doesn't solve the problems that it claims to be solving, and in fact, it will create other problems, not to mention more bureaucracy and drain resources from the city. So let me go over a few points. So this is essentially self-certification of permits. And it's brought forth out of a lot of anecdotes about how difficult the city's permitting system has been over the years. And I've always acknowledged that when I got here, that yeah, the system was clunky and bureaucratic, but we also set out to fix the system. We went through a laborious process to really determine exactly where the clunkiness was, where the delay was. We met with at least 10 former project applicants, all whom were not happy with the city, but they were willing to sit down with us and reevaluate their individual cases to show us where they had a problem. And we, in turn, were able to show them where we had some problems. So we actually studied the problem. We studied it in order to actually come up with a set of solutions. And we've made tremendous progress to streamline our permitting process. We've got major projects, not just minor ones, but major ones going through the system now that are yielding positive results. So that's one. Two, self-certification is extremely dangerous because it essentially allows the private sector to self-certify and say that the project that they're going to build will meet, they're going to promise that they will meet health and safety codes, building health and safety codes. And I've said before, that might sound appealing if it's your project, Daniel. Let's say you're going to renovate your house or you're going to build a building for a business. You might like that because you think it's cheaper and faster. But imagine if someone is doing that next door to where you live or work. Are you going to feel safe about that? So it doesn't actually solve anything. It creates a major liability down the road because we can only discover the problem after the fact. The system we have now allows us to discover a lot of problems before the construction begins. Now, this system that Mr. Starr is proposing to the public requires the city to actually stand up an entire training division so that we can train the private sector on how to self-certify. So that's a little odd coming from someone who is a libertarian extremist who is anti-government, anti-bureaucracy, and anti-tax. Well, with this, I need more tax money to set up this division to train the private sector on how to self-certify. And it also, he also claims, as he did in the neighborhood forum last week, that you can always audit. I'm not sure exactly what that means because how do you audit a building before it's built? And we're talking about code inspections, construction inspections. We're not talking about auditing here. This is not a two-dimensional problem that someone can just solve at their desk. So puts the general public at serious risk. And we had a resident come to the podium last year, and she said the easiest thing to understand about why self-certification is dangerous. She mentioned the Boeing airplane company. And to me, that really hits the nail on the head. So we have acknowledged that our permitting system was clunky and we have fixed it. And we still have more fixes in the works. We are succeeding with major projects going through our system. The system is working, and most importantly, it will yield safe projects. Self-certification, when the primary motive and interest is to save time and money, I guarantee you that's a recipe for disaster. This is why we have government, and this is why government is good.
Now, I know it might be a little bit difficult to really give an answer on this, but with the changes that the city made, what is now the average time for a permit to go through this process to actually be issued to whoever, a homeowner or a business trying to move forward?
So it depends on the permit and the project. And I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I guarantee you I can get them emailed to you and you can post them. There are different categories of permits and plans and the size of projects.
Okay.
Do those and you can publish those.
And I will appreciate that, and we'll get that publish onto our
But,
Facebook page.
but I know it's much faster than it was 3 years ago. I know that much.
Sounds good to me because I also watched that forum um, from the INCO where it was mentioned that an audit could be done before the project and after the project or any time the city. My only concern with it was that Measure F was pretty much saying, city, you have an issue, fix it. But they needed this measure and that it was an optional um, for developers to take this streamline or self-certification. And I'm glad you brought up that Bowen um, comment because I do remember that same comment as well, that we saw within months times 3 Boeing planes that were self-certified go down and kill hundreds of people, which is a very dark time. Um,
Very,
so
very
thank
Mr. Starr also that there are other cities in California that do this, and he points to the city of Elk Grove. So I strongly recommend anyone that's viewing your program now or later to pick up the phone and call the city of Elk Grove and ask them how it's been going. Just call and find out. Take their word for it.
Now, I do have a comment about that because he said that in the city's presentation, you guys ultimately lied by saying that certain communities weren't doing that. What information is he going off from versus what he presented during the INCO forum?
I don't know. You're interviewing him. You have to ask him. But when I view these things, it's 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 star information, and I can't rely on it. But again, call the city of Elk Grove, one of the cities that he highlights as an example, and talk to them.
Sounds good. So we'll go. Any final comments on Measure F, or are you good?
The other point though that is important for people to consider is that's also going to raise insurance rates because things are now self-certified. If it passes, it'll raise insurance rates. So enjoy that too.
Thank you. So the next measure that we're going to touch on is Measure L, which is increasing city treasurer's powers, which ultimately takes the chief financial officer, the CFO position, which is a hired position, and merges it with the city treasurer, which is an elected position. What are your feelings on that particular? I guess ultimately, what are if pros and cons for this measure?
Daniel, there are no pros. This measure is exceedingly reckless for this community. This measure does the exact opposite of the proponents of what Mr. Starr and Phil Molina are telling people, and it's highly deceptive and deceiving. They claim that this measure will provide checks and balances when all it does is actually consolidate all the city's budget authority under one person. It does not provide checks and balances, and they claim that there are no checks and balances now, right? They claim that I make all the budget decisions, and that's simply not true. I mentioned before that I have a team of professionals that I work with, that I rely on. And they, in turn, all have their professionals who are the second level managers across the city. And not to mention, then we have the city council that has to bless everything. And actually, it's the council who has the sole authority to decide on the city's budget. Now, what they claim, and again, Mr. Starr claimed this at the neighborhood forum last week. And what he said was, look at the city's finance department over the last 6 years. And that's why Measure L is important, to consolidate the chief financial officer, which in every other city in California is a professional staff, not an elected person. There's no city in California, including actually the state of California, doesn't do it the way they're proposing. All cities have a professional chief financial officer who is hired with job criteria, with strong qualifications. Their measure has zero professional qualification, zero. So someone can become your next city treasurer now or later and chief financial officer, and they can just be, right, a registered voter here in Oxnard. They don't need to have had one class of accounting or finance or investment. They don't have to have any training, let alone years of experience and training. So Mr. Starr says you need this, and Mr. Molina, this is their duo. They say that you need this because of the finance department over the last 6 years. Now, here's the thing. They continue to live in the past. They are fixated in the rearview mirror because it's easy to be the hero of the past because you know what happened. You know the plot, you know the ending, you know who the good guys were and the bad guys were. So it's easy to be a good guy of the past. But they're unwilling to recognize the actual present and our reality. So the reality of our finance department is this. We have a basically brand new chief financial officer, a brand new assistant chief financial officer. And in the last year, there's been 50% turnover in the finance department. We have a new finance department. And this past year, the independent financial audit was returned without a new finding of material weakness. Now, under normal circumstances, that's nothing to brag about. But you only have to go back to 2015, where that audit returned 65 findings of material weakness. So you can't tell me that we're not making significant progress and improvements. So the issue here is saying that, you've got let's say that your home team has a big game this weekend. And instead of looking at the players on the field to know how well you're going to do, you're going to look at the team that lost the big game 6 years ago. It makes no sense. We have to live in the present in order to get to the future. We can't live in the past. So this measure would consolidate power, take away checks and balances, and would put it in the hands of an individual who quite possibly may not have any experience in finance, investment, treasury, accounting, audit, none of it. It truly is possible. Now, what they claim is, well, then, we just think the voters aren't smart enough. No, that's not the case. We know how smart the voters are. The problem is when you manipulate and deceive like this, right? And then what happens? Now, what happens if we were to get such a person who's actually incapable or incompetent? Well, last night at the candidates forum, that question was asked of the two candidates running for this position for treasurer, and they couldn't answer. What is the mechanism for holding that person accountable? Because there really isn't one. What you would have to do is mount a expensive and disruptive recall campaign, if you can get that done, or you have to wait the 4 years to vote for a better person. So this is not a system that exists in any city in California. It does not exist in the state of California government structure. And I challenge you to find this anywhere else in the country. Again, it is a ill-informed proposed solution that is not a solution to anything. And all it does is create a position that is almost out of reach for us to manage.
Under the current system for the CFO, do you know what those qualifications are? because and this is just for clarification to the viewers, is that the city treasurer is an elected position, and the only three requirements is to be a minimum of the age of 18, to be a registered voter, as well as a resident of the city. But what are the CFO's
CFO
qualifications?
needs to have, I believe it's at least 8 years of experience, and I believe it's at least 5 years of progressive management experience. And obviously the requisite training. Um, Now, I don't, actually, I am going to brag, but it's not about me. Our current CFO, Mr. Kevin Riper, has been doing this work for, I think, over 25, maybe 30 years. He was educated both at Harvard and at Stanford. And he's been a municipal finance officer for the bulk of his career. And there is hardly anyone in the state that can best him in this profession. So we are extremely fortunate to have been able to recruit him. But those are the qualifications you're talking about in terms of the team of experts that I rely on.
Now, say for instance, we're going to play the what if game. What if Measure L does pass? And now we are seeing an elected official take on the duties of the chief financial officer. What ultimately are they overseeing as far as staff, the budget, investments? How much and what are they overseeing?
I believe, according to Measure L, it's basically all. It's, they try to say that, oh, they eventually it goes to the council, which ultimately is true because they didn't put in here that this supra treasurer would also get to make the final decision. So they didn't try to take the budgeting authority away from the council, but it would mean that this person would be obviously both the treasurer and the CFO and would develop the city's budget by him or herself. It's again, the systems of municipal government that we have in place, while they can always be improved, they have evolved over a century. And there are reasons why we have it set up the way we have. There's a reason that we have the built-in checks and balances. It's not always perfect, but it's always improvable, which we do. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater in this scenario is just reckless. It's really, really reckless. And again, the candidates were unable to answer the question last night that were placed to them. What if the person can't do this job? What is the remedy? And there's no remedy, certainly none that is manageable in the time frame that you would need to fix a problem like that. You would have to, again, either mount an expensive and disruptive recall campaign, or you simply wait, for the 4-year cycle. Think of the damage that can be caused during that period. But Daniel, even that, while it is an extreme, just the overall concept of consolidating those offices under someone with no professional criteria, that's just foolish. It is just foolish. Why would you do that? Would you trust your family's finances to someone that has no finance experience? Think about this. Think about this. Would you do that? If you were looking at, how to plan your finances for your family and for your kids' future and for their college fund, whatever it is that is important to your family, would you put it in the hands of a financial advisor that actually had no financial training? That's just absurd. It's thumbing its nose at how local government is supposed to work. And again, these proposals come from someone who actually doesn't have any experience in this realm, any experience in running a large organization or in running a local municipal government. So it's fine for anyone and everyone to provide the critique, to tell us what they don't like, to tell us what they do like, to tell us they want different outcomes. That's fine. But you can't prescribe solutions out of utter ignorance. That's just playing with the future and the fate of this entire community. It's just wrong.
And I agree with you, Alex, that consolidating the two positions, there you lose that whole check and balance. You have an elected official that can only be removed by either recall or they resign on their own or the 4 years and people don't vote for them back in. But the flip side of that argument is, the city, and you made mention of this, that the city thinks that the voters are dumb, is that they won't elect somebody that doesn't have any experience. But again, there's no, like you said, there is no professional criteria. An 18-year-old can ultimately come if they run a great enough campaign. They can ultimately be the city treasurer and oversee the city's budget and a staff of over 20 people, I'm assuming, and so much more. And like you may mention, can actually cause a lot of harm to the city within the first few months or maybe a year.
Well, Daniel, of course, the voters would not want to vote for someone without experience. However, what happens in this scenario when there's one candidate who has no qualifications? He or she can get into the office with one vote, his or hers. Think about that. Now, what if there are 2 or even 3 candidates and none of them were actually qualified? One of them will win. So this isn't about assuming that the voters can't make the best choice. This is about manipulating the voters into thinking that this is a solution to a problem that's actually already been fixed in terms of how we manage our finances.
Now, there's also been emails sent out by the current city treasurer that says that Measure L is going to restore the duties that were illegally taken by the city. Now, I don't know if it's in litigation, if you can talk on that, but what are your comments for that statement?
He's wrong. Yes, I understand he is suing the city over it. Bottom line is he was stripped of his administrative duties, not his statutory duties. He was stripped of his administrative duties because of how he treated city staff. So the bottom line is, if it had been any other manager at any level who had done what he had done, I would have fired that person on the spot. But because he's an elected, I cannot fire him, but I have the right to remove his administrative duties because they were delegated to him from the city council and the city manager. So that's the bottom line. Again, he wants to, Mr. Molina just loves to make things up. He just can't face the music as it is. He wants to rewrite the whole score. But the problem is the music is what it is. I'll give you a great example with regard to Measure E. He sent out an email to a group of people. And by the way, you never know who they are because what he does is he'll blind copy, several hundred people. And he'll tell them whatever he wants to tell them. And the thing is, you can't fact check him because even if you sent him a response, say, Mr. Molina, no, this is not correct. No one gets the benefit of that, right? He's not going to send that correction out. So he sent out an email to the public. We don't know exactly how many, because he's opposed to Measure E. And he sent out an email claiming that there were over 400 cities with a lower sales tax rate than Oxnard, which isn't true. It isn't accurate. Those are not the facts. He relied on a list from the state that had over 1,000 taxing districts. So a great example is The list included, which was, by the way, the list he sent to the public, included Whiskey Town. Yeah, now Whiskey Town is actually no longer a town, and it was never a city, but he used it in his version of the statistics to manipulate the public. So it's really difficult for me, to constantly be spending my time correcting the facts with Mr. Molina. That's why he's called Mr. Misleading at City Hall. You just can't rely on what he says.
Thank you for that response. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next measure, and we roughly touched on it based off of the other measures that we spoke at, and that's Measure M, which is to deal with city meetings, the procedural rules, and how they're conducted. A little bit of background for our viewers is that this measure is to stop meetings to occur before 5 p.m. and that also gives the option for the city to have meetings on the weekends as well. But the CAGs and any other committee, citizen advisory groups are not part of Measure M, which I find to be a little odd, but it is what it is. Your comments on that?
Another sort of boondoggle here. And again, quite interesting if you think it through, coming from someone who is supposedly anti-bureaucracy. What this would do, first of all, it doesn't solve a single problem that he's identified. And in fact, if you go back to the forum, the neighborhood forum from last week, and you listen to how Mr. Starr argued around and around on this issue, he actually argued all the way back around so far that he ended up right behind himself. So what this does is it actually requires more bureaucracy. It requires me to figure out how to fund more services to do the video production. He's essentially saying, first of all, that you can only meet at night. But at the same time, he's saying, but people can watch the pre-taped videos at their convenience. Well, if that's the case, then why does it matter exactly what time the meeting is? So there's a false argument right there. Now, to require staff to pre-videotape their presentations to the council, then play it at the council meeting, and then the staff person needs to be there to answer questions. So now we just doubled it up. Now, if we take his logic further, then maybe we should videotape everything so that we're not doubling up. So how about we take the staff presentation, take the council question and answer, and take the decision making? How about if we do that? Well, guess what? That happens at a regular council meeting because it is all videotapes and rebroadcast later. Now, the key is this entire measure fails to take into account technology and fails to even recognize what we've all been experiencing in the last 7 or 8 months, which is the convenience of doing meetings and sessions like we're doing right now online. I didn't have to go anywhere. You don't have to go anywhere. And the people who are watching us right now get to do it at the comfort of their homes or wherever they may be. And the people who aren't able to tune in on a Friday night because there's something else going on, although I can't imagine anything more profound. No, I'm kidding. But they can watch it anytime later at their convenience. So no one loses the benefit of the discussion. So now here's another thing that's interesting is why after all these years are we so stuck on Robert's Rules of Order, which most institutions consider archaic and clumsy and cumbersome. And how is that gonna make our meetings more efficient? Well, it turns out his wife is one of the few certified trainers for this, I believe. So that's an interesting setup. Is she, because it says we have to have someone like that train us. So is that what this is about? I don't know. It raises a lot of questions for me. And then to claim that we can just have these meetings on Saturdays, well, wait a minute. our employees have rights. So I can't just willy-nilly say, okay, I'm changing the work schedule. Now we work on Saturdays. Well, for someone who's opposed to overtime, he seems to be inviting it here because our employees have contracts and have rights. I can't just say, okay, from now on, we also work on Saturdays. It doesn't work that way. So what this measure does is it actually adds layer of bureaucracy. It requires more resources, not less. And it doesn't change anything because the sunshine ordinance that I talked about earlier provides all the time for people to review all the information, and they get to chime in at their convenience because they have a ton of time. They can call, they can email, they can do the video. They can. I mean, I joked about they can send smoke signals, although we don't want you to do that. But there are many ways to tell City Hall, whether you want to tell me or the elected officials what you think. And you don't have to wait till Tuesday night at 6 p.m. You can do it before, and in some instances, you might need to do it afterwards. But the relative convenience for the public to view all the information that is important, we already have it now. Relying on Tuesday night at 6 p.m. is a relic of the 20th century. We're in the 21st century, and he's proposing a solution for the 20th century. It makes no sense. It makes no sense.
I do appreciate that. And, one thing is that the Sunshine Ordinance, or well, actually what you did was bring in consolidating the committees that were in the city. I remember attending city meetings, committee meetings, the financial task force. There would be like 15 different meetings, and these occurred at 9 o'clock in the morning, different days of the week, and they were in areas that were not easily accessible to be video recorded. Now, committee meetings take place in the council's chambers where it is video recorded, and it's condensed down to 4 committees that relatively just merged a bunch of those that were independent of each other. So you may mention that the committees actually have a 7 days before the actual committee that residents can view the agenda, view staff reports, ask questions of those 3 committee members and staff, and then they'll get to see it again at the city council meeting 12 days before the actual council meeting. Now, one of the comments that he made during the INCO forum was that staff or the city council can ultimately say, no, all comments were given at the committee. We're not going to listen to public comments at the city council, and we're going to go ahead and make our decision. What do you say or respond to him making that allegation that the public's being cut out from the decision making?
Okay. That is hogwash. Find me one example where that's happened. Find me one example where that's happened. Right? The purpose, again, of the committee is to allow a subgroup of the council. These are formal committees where all the Brown Act rules and the Sunshine rules apply. Again, so that they can dive into significant issues deeper, chew on it more, debate it more. And then when it comes to the council, again, depends on the item. Sometimes everybody needs to weigh in. And there are some times when people can review what happened at the committee and they're happy with it. But the public still has a right to weigh in at the council meeting. The public's never been denied the option of weighing in on something that's been through the committee, and they never will be denied that right and that option. It's, again, look, everybody has a right and is entitled to communicate in whatever way that is convenient to them, critique, criticism, displeasure, or support how City Hall is being conducted, how business is being conducted. Everyone has a right and is entitled to do that. But you don't have the right to make up your own facts. Now, I understand where this country is, but in Oxnard, facts still matter. So we can have a contest of ideas here about how to approach things, how to improve things, but they still have to be based on a set of facts that are real. People can't just make things up in order to manipulate the public. It doesn't work that way. Or actually, I should say it should not work that way.
Thank you, Alex, for that. And we'll go ahead and move into the last measure, which is measure N, and it talks about roads and sunsetting measure O. So a little bit of context on that is that if measure N was to pass, that the city must meet certain standards for road conditions, and if not, it would ultimately overturn measure O and sunset it a lot sooner than what the voters voted on. Your comments on that?
This is a poison pill measure. Now, I can understand how it was easy to gather signatures for this by saying and promising better roads. Very, very easy. I mean, any of these would have been, these measures would have been, and clearly were easy to gather signatures. You know, it depends on what you tell people versus what you're not telling people. So the way I view this is, and let me just cut to the chase of this, because this is what I think it's really about. Given Mr. Starr's political leanings, like I said, I believe he's a libertarian extremist. I believe this is his effort to manipulate the public in order to successfully end a voter initiative special tax. I mean, it's not a special tax, but the sales tax increase. Because if you look at it, and given someone who is proclaimed as being great with numbers, there's no way we can do this. You don't even have to be a math genius to figure out we can't do this. Unless, right? I mean, this is an unreasonable mission, an unreasonable expectation, unless you are willing to forego a host of other services and programs, including public safety. Now, again, at the last forum last week, the neighborhood forum, it was put to Mr. Starr, would you, and I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but it was, the premise was, would you rather put money into improving the roads and take it away from the fire stations? And he refused to answer the question. Because the reality is, in order to improve the roads at the rates that he's put on in this measure, we would have to spend an exorbitant amount of money, both from Measure O and the rest of the general fund, to meet those goals. And that's why I keep saying it's mathematically impossible. It's unreasonable. So this really is an effort to undo Measure O even though it sunsets, right? His goal is to undo Measure O. Now, do we need better street maintenance? Of course we do. Can we do a better job? Yes, but we need additional revenue to do it. This argument that we refuse to pave the roads, that's more hogwash, because everyone has seen those roads that we've been able to pave and repave and rebuild over the last few years. I know people know this. It's just not as much or as fast as we all want. But don't buy the story that we refuse to take care of the roads. We're taking care of the roads as best as we can and as fast as we can with the revenue that we are provided. Again, think over the last couple of years. You've seen road construction happening throughout Oxnard. It's just not as fast as we want, but it can never be as fast as what's set out in this measure unless you are willing to cancel a host of other services. And I'm going to probably be forced to, at the very least, brown out a fire station, at the very least, in order to do this.
So I again, I watched that forum from the INCO, and one of his comments that he made in regards to Measure O was that there are many other cities that are able to maintain, repair the roads without an additional sales tax.
Mhm.
But in the beginning, I also made comment that Measure O has done a lot, um, because it is a general tax, that it has actually saved our city multiple times. And again, most recently, it saved a fire station and a couple of other services, at the discretion of the city council.
Right.
If Measure O was to be sunset and Measure E doesn't pass, how what type of shape is our city going to be in, knowing that Measure E didn't pass and Measure O ultimately, because like you made mention, we can't repair to the certain standards that he has put forth in the measure. What type of condition does our city move forward in?
Well, it's gonna get much worse, much more rapidly. And like I said before, we will essentially end up being a essential services city, just mostly public safety and garbage collection and water and sewer. It would wipe out basically all of our civic programs and services, everything that makes for a vibrant community, everything. That's what it would happen. Now, if that's what people, if that's the city people want to live in, that's the city we can have. We can still manage that without Measure E and with Measure O sunsetting. But everyone needs to understand that's going to be terrible. It will be terrible. And I'm not kidding. I, I've never tried to paint a doom and gloom picture. I've always been very straightforward and very matter of fact about our circumstances. So I can lay that out for you in terms of how it would degrade and how fast it would happen. These measures are extremely manipulative, and that's the problem I have with it. It's not about whether voters have a right to vote up or down. Of course we do. I'm a voter. I struggle to understand the ballot book every time there's an election. And it's very easy to be manipulated, especially when the manipulation is played on your frustration. So I get the frustration that we all feel. Don't think that city staff are proud of the condition the city's in. Don't think that the city staff aren't aware of the problems we have. We are certainly aware. Many of us actually live here with our families. Many of us actually raise our kids here. So it's not that we're unaware or that we're uncaring. We truly care. And these measures are, you know, they're all premised on the fact that everybody at City Hall, with the exception of Phil Molina, is corrupt. This presumes that it's that not only the city manager is corrupt, it presumes the police chief, that's Scott Whitney, is corrupt. It presumes that after 30 years, he doesn't know how to run a police department in an efficient and cost-effective way. It assumes that Chief Bass was corrupt and didn't know how to provide fire services under lean times. It presumes that our chief financial officer doesn't know what he's doing, even though he has the best education one can get in America. And he has 30 years of experience. And it presumes that every single other elected official must be corrupt. Now, come on. I've only been here 2 years, but I'm telling you, that's not Oxnard anymore. I don't know exactly what happened in the past. I can only read the reports. But as I've said before, I don't have a time machine. I can't go back and provide different advice to people or prevent people from making knuckleheaded decisions or choices. I can only work to move this city forward. So please, 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 please truly read what these measures are and do the research and try to understand the actual fallout of these measures. Now, there is a report that the city had conducted. It's on the city's website that actually spells out what the fallout of these measures would be. And Daniel, the final thing I want to say is, whatever the outcome is, who's accountable and who's responsible for managing the fallout? And the bottom line is this: Mr. Starr and even Mr. Molina, they can just wash their hands and walk away and say, well, the voters chose. But if the voters are choosing something that is not what it appears, and that is very manipulative and deceitful and is full of poison pills, then who's responsible and who's accountable? Well, in the end, it's me and the city council. We're accountable and responsible for the fallout of all this. We have to manage whether the city moves forward for a better future or whether the city has to completely scale itself back and get rid of all the civic services and programs. You still have to have a city council and a city manager do either of those tasks. So it's really the choice. And that's why I've been saying that Measure E is not a referendum about the past, because we can't go back there, but it is a choice for the future. And the question is, do we want to continue to build a better future for Oxnard, or do we want to sit around here and throw mud at each other and yell and complain and point fingers about the past? It's that simple. So choose for the future or choose to wallow in the past. I think that's as succinct as I can put it.
So let me ask you, now say we're going to go back and we're going to play that what if game. What if all four measures that was proposed by Mr. Starr ends up ultimately passing? What steps would the city end up taking afterwards? Will there be any lawsuits, or will the city just kind of swallow the pill and carry out what those measures propose?
So here's how I approach it. So there are obviously different options, which you've just laid out. So we already know what the fallout will be. We've had the study done, so it's there in black and white. So we know what the fallout is. And as a group of professionals at City Hall, we can draw you a map with a timeline, with a budget, so that you can understand it. So the question would be, would we allow the city to crumble just so that the voters can see the actual fallout? And that's, or would we, based on the evidence that we have, would we ask the court to determine whether these initiatives were appropriate or not? And that is a decision that cannot be made by me or the city attorney. That's actually a decision that would be made by the city council. But those are the options. Those are the options.
Now, what do you say to those that believe, again, many of the issues that occurred happened before you became city manager, but they seem to continue even now that you've been here a little bit over 2 years, that this is just city government, and it has been quoted many times by Mr. Starr, that it's just city government trying to bully him, silence him, and so their only response is to do lawsuits and silence the public. What do you say to those people that say that the city is just picking on Mr. Starr and just wants to sue him?
I would say take a half a step back and look at the big picture. Um, the city, when the city needs to defend itself, I don't understand how that's bullying anyone, number one. Number two, what is the interaction between Mr. Starr and the city? He's the one inserting himself, right? He, as of yet, he's not been elected to represent the people of Oxnard. I have 7 people that I report to who have been elected to represent the city of Oxnard. Those are the people that I have to answer to, as well as the broad public. But think about this now. Mr. Starr has engaged himself in the city, and he claims that it's because he cares about the residents, but I actually question the motive. So if you look at what he's done, the only reason that we're talking about him and his initiatives is because he's bought this seat at the table. It's the only reason. The rest of the residents have to go through the normal process, and frankly, because they can't afford to buy a seat at the table. So now what do I mean by that? If you look at his various campaign disclosures, it's an exorbitant amount of money that he has spent to impose his will on City Hall. And again, I know people have said to me, well, why don't you just negotiate with him? Well, again, he's not elected to represent the public. Would you want me to take my time to negotiate with any wealthy person who wants to force something at City Hall just because they have the money? I mean, I summarized the amount of money that he spent. So he has, I put it on a card for me so I could remember. Let me see if I can get this on screen. He has loaned himself over the years almost $400,000. By any measure, I would say that's a chunk of wealth. He's raised $117,000 from outside of Oxnard, and he's raised $77,000 in Oxnard. So I think this goes back probably five, maybe 6 years. But in all, he has spent $587,000, a large chunk of it his own money, to prescribe solutions for the city that are not actual solutions. I've heard him say at the city council that something to the effect of he's never seen or met a government program that he thought was good. I'm telling you, we're dealing with a libertarian extremist whose goal is to grind government to a halt and to end taxation. But that's not the system we live in. Our community needs the goods, the services, sometimes the goods, and the programs that we provide. And it's funded through taxation. So unless we adopt as a country a model from another country around the world, this is the system we have, and frankly, it's actually very effective. But when someone spends this much money to buy a seat at the table, even though they were never elected to do so, if there's a good idea, I'm always open, and I'm always open to critique. But you can't force it down our throats, and you shouldn't, frankly, manipulate the public to do so. So I think people need to redefine the definition of who's the bully here. But people in Oxnard have a lot of opinions and a lot of criticism of the city. And I hear those all the time, and the council members hear those all the time. They just can't buy a seat at the table to force these kinds of confrontations, which are utterly unnecessary, unhelpful, and do not, contrary to the name of his organization, do not move Oxnard forward. This only relies on the frustration of the past. Everything he does keeps this community mired in the past. But I was hired here to rebuild this organization and to move this city into the future. And I'm very focused on doing that.
Thank you, Alex, for that comments. And one of the comments that you made at the INCO forum last week, and I completely agree with you on this because it pretty much it speaks truth to power, is that our elected officials are accountable to us, and that it is our responsibility as residents to hold our elected officials accountable, not only around election time, but every year, every month, every day, because ultimately they are up there because we put them up there as voters. And I really appreciated that comment because there, and you've heard it since being part of the city, that management is just running the show and they're just out of control, and mismanagement and just corruption through the core. And mind you, to our viewers, in no way, shape, or form am I defending the city, but I want people to really understand that at the end of the day, it is us, the residents of the city of Oxnard, that holds the strings of our elected officials to tell them, like, look, this is what we believe that should be happening or not happen. And I just wanted to share that I do appreciate that comment because that really is speaking truth to power, that our residents need to take more of interest in local government, not only focus on what's happening on the state, not only focus on what's happening on the federal level, but also focus on what's happening right here in their own backyard. So I want to say thank you for that comment because, again, it speaks really truth to power on that one.
Yeah, citizenship, you're right.
Okay, so we have come to the end. We have spoken on all 5 measures. Is there any final words that you want to give on any of the measures or any comments as we come to an end of our conversation tonight?
Measure E is about this community's future. The star measures are all about the city's past. That's the bottom line. And I hope people, when they read these and do their research, please take your time and really read everything that you can find. Measure E is a choice for our future. And I live here, my mother lives with me. I want the best future possible for this community. And I'm gonna work my ass off to make sure that we get there. The star measures are all mired in the past, but the past is over. None of us have a time machine. So the only place for us to go is towards the future.
Thank you, Alex. And again, thank you for taking this opportunity to come join me in this conversation and really try to provide the information out to the public on these very important measures that are going to be affecting our city for the years to come. So thank you for that. And thank you for being very honest. I'm looking back and forth on with listening to you as well as reading the comments, and many of the public are saying that the answers are very honest and they see that. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, this is Oxnard City Manager Alex Nguyen. So please be sure to do your due diligence and reading all these measures and really deciding on what's best for Oxnard's future. Please be sure to join me Monday for another special edition of Oxnard Live at 6 p.m. as we have Mr. Starr come on, and we will be talking to him about the measures as well as his candidacy for District 3. Again, another special edition of Oxnard Live, Monday, October 5th at 6 p.m. right here. Again, this is Oxnard Live. All of it's live and 100% real. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to our viewers. And any final words, Alex?
This is lemonade, soft lemonade. And I will be tuning in Monday evening for that interview. I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate your time. And hopefully in the future, I look forward to coming back for a new interview.
Yes, of course. Thank you again, Alex. Thank you to our viewers and all the comments that came in. I did try to answer, ask as many of those questions that came in. So again, thank you, everybody. Please be sure to join us on Monday, October 5th for a special edition of Oxnard Live. I'm your host, Daniel Chavez Jr. Thank you and good night.